welcome to Prints and Politics, Print Study Day at the Met in collaboration with the IFPDA. I am Jenny Gibbs, Executive Director of the IFPDA and the IFPDA Foundation. Print Study Day is an annual event organized by the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, in conjunction with the IFPDA Fine Art Print Fair, which is currently online on Artsy. It is held each year during what has traditionally been known as Print Week. This year, Print Week is online, obviously, and it morphed into Print Month because really, how many Zooms can you watch in one day? The IFPDA and I are tremendously grateful for the opportunity to partner with our friends at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and all the cultural partners who have made Print Month possible. Special thanks go to Freda Spira, Associate Curator in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Freda is the lead organizer for Print Study Day, and it was her vision which shaped today's timely selection of speakers and topics. I would also like to thank our speakers, Maureen Warren from the Krannert Art Museum, independent scholar Allison Stag, and Carmen, Ramos, and Claudia Zapata from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Today's moderator is Nadine Orenstein, the Drew Hines Curator in charge of the Department of Drawings and Prints in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. As a side note, Nadine, along with Freda and Catherine Jenkins, are the recipients of the IFPDA Foundation Book Award this year for their publication, The Renaissance of Etching. We're hosting an online conversation with Nadine, Freda, and Catherine on October 20th, and you'll find the link to register on the Print Month calendar, which is at fineartprintfair.org. And with that, I'm going to sit back and enjoy the papers and hand off the baton to Nadine.
Thank you, Jenny, and thanks everyone for coming. I want to express special thanks to Jenny Gibbs and the IFPDA for being so supportive of this event, and especially to Freda Spira, who every year has organized this event and does such a great job. As you may know, we have been hosting this event for several years. Normally, we welcome you in our auditorium at the Met in the Uris Center. We bring down artworks from our collection that relate to things that people have been talking about in their talks. Unfortunately, that space only holds 120 people. Here today, we have over 400 people signed up. So that is the plus side of this event, and also everybody has a front row seat. So I will introduce our speakers today, and the way we'll set it up is that I'll first introduce everyone. We will proceed with the different lectures, and then at the end we will have the Q&A all together. If you have questions that come up as someone is speaking, please type them into the Q&A feature down at the bottom of the screens. Freda will be monitoring that Q&A and sending me the questions that she finds would be useful to ask. So really feel free to start sending your questions in as the talks are going along. Our first speaker today is Maureen Warren, who's a curator of European American art at Krannert Art Museum at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She received her PhD from Northwestern University. She is a scholar of early modern Netherlandish art and has written several articles about Dutch political prints. Her exhibition on political printmaking in the Dutch Republic, which will have an accompanying scholarly volume, will open at the Krannert Art Museum in the fall of 2020 before traveling to other venues. Allison Stag is an art historian based in Germany, specializing in 18th and 19th century transatlantic visual print culture. She has held several academic positions, including the Terra Foundation, visiting professor in American art history at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and lecturer in American art history at the Obama Institute for Transnational Studies, Johannes Gutenberg Universität in Mainz. Her research on North American political caricature prints has been published widely, most recently with articles in Print Quarterly and Imprint, the Journal of American Historical Print Collectors Society. Dr. Stag is the author of a forthcoming book to be published by Penn State University Press, Prints of a New Kind, Political Caricature in the United States, 1790 to 1828. Carmen Ramos is acting chief curator at and curator of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Since joining the museum in 2010, she has dramatically expanded the museum's pioneering collection of Latinx art with an eye towards changing the exclusion of Latinx art from the US art history and capturing the broad aesthetic and regional range of the field. Ramos's exhibitions at the Smithsonian include Tamayo, the New York Years in 2017, Down These Mean Streets, Community and Place in Urban Photography in 2017, Our America, the Latino Presence in American Art in 2013, and the forthcoming Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to Now. It will be opening soon in November. Ramos holds an MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. Claudia E. Zapata is a curatorial assistant of Latinx art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and is a doctoral candidate at Southern Methodist University. She received her BA and MA in art history from the University of Texas at Austin, specializing in classic Maya art. Her research interests include curatorial methodologies of identity-based exhibitions, Chicanx and Latinx art, digital humanities, people of color zines, and designer toys. Zapata has curated exhibitions at Mexic Art Museum in Austin and other Texas institutions, and has published articles in Panhandle Plains Historical Review, Joyas, I guess it's pronounced, Azatlan Hemisphere, and El Mundo Zurdo, 7, siete. Carmen and Claudia are co-organizing this exhibition, Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to Now, and that opens November 20th, 2020 at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So without further ado, I will pass on to Maureen Warren for the first talk.
Great, thank you, Nadine, and thank you to the organizers. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about Dutch political prints, and a lot of this is derived from the research for the upcoming exhibition that was mentioned, tentatively titled Fake News and Lying Pictures about Dutch Political Prints, which will be on view at Krannert Art Museum in the fall of 2022. And like that exhibition, I'm going to be focusing on primarily methodology. So while you will get some Dutch history, it's really just enough to understand what's happening in the prints. And it's more about the methods printmakers use to convey political and ideological messages. And unlike the exhibition, I'm going to kind of lean a little bit more towards contemporary political cartoons to show how these methods are still very much alive and well 400 years later. So I see a lot of friends in the list who are Netherlandish specialists, but certainly there must be many new to it. So this is just a map of the northern and southern Netherlands. So present day Netherlands and Belgium to show you the territory we'll be discussing today. And this is at a point in time when the Dutch, the northern Netherlands, are fighting against Habsburg Spain for independence. And that's for various reasons, for religious, political, financial reasons. And they're fighting a war with the southern Netherlands, or more or less present day Belgium, remaining part of the Habsburg Empire. I'm going to be talking a lot about these two guys. On the left, you see Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, and on the right, Maurits of Orange, or Maurits of Nassau, or Prince Maurits. Maurits is the stadholder, which is basically the military commander. It's an elected position, but it's almost always a Prince of Orange. He commands the land and sea troops. The Dutch don't have a king, but he's the highest noble figure, so he has quasi-monarchical powers. Oldenbarnevelt is the advocate or lawyer for Holland, for the province of Holland, the most wealthy province and powerful province by far. So he controls the province that pays the bills, and that includes the military budget. Now, these two are great friends for a long time until the war with Spain comes to a truce, and they're trying to decide the course of what will happen after this truce, this 12 years truce from 1609 to 1621. Oldenbarnevelt, kind of representing the wealthy oligarch merchant class, wants peace, because peace means money for traders, means less war bills for Holland to pay, And Maurits, his prestige and power being tied to the military, is one of the reasons he would like the war to Spain to recommence. So these two one-time friends have a falling out with very grave ramifications for the country. This becomes entangled with the religious debate that I promise you give the very minimum amount of details, but it's necessary for these broadsheets. So the Dutch Reformed Church, the official church that the government officials need to belong to, has a fight within it between Arminius and Gomarus. And it's basically about predestination and how much free will people have with regard to predestination. I will not get into it. But the important thing to know is that Oldenbarnevelt supports Arminius, as do many very learned merchants. And Maurits supports the Gomarus, which is a much, much bigger group and includes a lot of refugees from the southern Netherlands or Spanish Netherlands. So you can see in this broadside the depiction of how this fight is taking place. You have the States General or Dutch Parliament in the background, represented by the three guys kind of sitting on a dais. You have Arminian and Gomarus slightly before them, but the religious fight is the background. The foreground is the political fight. And this print, this broadside, or the sheet shows us a great strategy that artists were using, and that is referencing a really well-known image that already packed a punch. So here you're seeing a 16th century print, originally from Geneva, but it was copied in the Netherlands, showing the Protestant reformers who are on the right using scripture to win in a balance, to tip the scales in their favor against the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, they're cheating because this is a Protestant propaganda. So they've put the papal crown, they're standing on it, they're tugging on it. There's even a little devil trying to pull the scales, but they're still losing. They're still losing. So the viewer is meant to recognize the source, and they're meant to see Oldenbarnevelt and the civic and the provincial government people being like the Protestants, and Maurits being like the Catholics, even though Maurits is winning. And I'll explain why. It's unflattering in many reasons. So you have the States General, the basically Dutch Parliament, being likened to the papal court. And certainly for any Protestant country, propaganda where you're compared to Catholics is unflattering. And you have a scene of how this turns out. So you've got a scene out the window of soldiers giving up their weapons. These are mercenaries or Waardgelders that were authorized by Oldenbarnevelt to protect city magistrates from kind of angry supporters of Maurits and Gomarus. So Maurits came along and made them give up their weapons. So you know that looking at this picture of what was essentially a military coup out the window, that Maurits is going to override the government and use his military powers to win. So you have Maurits placing his sword alongside the writings by Calvin. And so we know from that Calvin's writing alone was not enough. Calvin and the Calvinists, the strict Calvinists, the Gomarists, they couldn't win based on religious argument alone. It took Maurits's sword, so that's what makes this a critical commentary. Also, it's likely that viewers of this would have seen that picture of a sword on top of scales, and they would have thought of the 4th century Gaulish chieftain Brennus. So Brennus is a chieftain that captures and sacks Rome, and the Gauls are offered 1,000 pounds of gold if they'll leave Rome. And the Gauls have weights that are different than the Roman weights, and there's a fight about whose weights are accurate. And Brennus throws his sword on top of the scales and says, "Vi victis," or "woe to the conquered." So basically, losers don't get to make the rules. So this is not a flattering comparison to Maurits, someone who sacks Rome, someone who uses might to get their way, someone who tips the scales. And then on the other side, where we would have the Protestant reformers, in the earlier print, we have Oldenbarnevelt and the other government officials, And there, that robe that you see and the cushions, those are references to garments and accessories of government officials. Government officials would sit on these special cushions and often wear these fur-lined robes. So that's a reference to their government powers. And then we also see some documents that say the right of every state. So you can think of this as very much like contemporary arguments about state rights versus federal rights. They're saying that Maurits in doing this has overridden civic and provincial rights. And that was very important because the Dutch Republic is essentially a confederacy. The federal government is very weak, and provincial power and city power is quite strong. So to violate the rights of the provinces, of the cities, is something that would be quite offensive to a lot of people. So this is a tactic we still see contemporary artists doing. These are political cartoons that rely on you knowing the earlier precedent in order to find it as funny as interesting, whether it's, you know, the Nighthawks or Washington crossing the Delaware. Here you see political cartoons about the death of Aretha Franklin and her entering a kind of musical heaven, or Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings. And they're that much more poignant, more biting, more interesting if you recognize the original and the meaning of the original work. But Western art history is no longer the sort of best method necessarily of conveying quickly a kind of visual shorthand for your argument. Much more useful is pop culture. So how many of you looking at this already know the song it references and maybe have the chorus in your mind? I'll save us all and not sing it, but you know, this is referencing Miley Cyrus's 2013 song, and especially the video, Wrecking Ball. This was by no means all of the political cartoons. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of cartoons that reference this song. Even this year, you can find spiky COVID balls swinging as wrecking balls. So this instantly conveys a lot of information and is eye-catching and funny because you get the reference. Things do not turn out well for Oldenbarnevelt. Because he's on this losing side, is accused of treason. He is beheaded. A man in his 70s, 30 odd years of public service, is beheaded before a large crowd. This causes a huge rift in the Dutch political scene that lasts for many generations. And we still see him reappearing on Dutch broadsides. So this is one from 1623, so 4 years after his death. His two sons had plotted to assassinate Prince Maurits, in part to have revenge, but for other reasons as well. So you see Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, again, beheaded 4 years earlier, on the head of this decapitated snake with the rest of the conspirators. So this is also another great strategy. You associate your enemies with a creature that is already very much reviled, hated, or feared. I mean, snakes, spiders, especially rats and mice in a lot of political cartooning now. It's a very effective strategy for conveying a lot of information quickly. And this is certainly an incredibly popular strategy now. This is just one. This is just one of many cartoons where, you know, a political leader at the head of a snake has inspired a wave of others, or supposedly inspired based on the perspective of the cartoonist. And you can see this work by Ben Garrison where, you know, an ISIS terrorist or Hillary Clinton is very much, according to the cartoonist, under the influence of President Obama. So there's other strategies as well that are less overt. This is a great example of a type of print called a newsprint, or a depiction of contemporary events. And it has many of the characteristics of these broadside newsprints. You have a catchy title, in this case, the Armenian Exodus, an image that is the same width as the text below, and then columns of text in letterpress, almost always in the vernacular. So to reach a wide audience, they're rarely if ever, in Latin. They're, Dutch, German, French. And you'll even see Dutch prints come out with the Dutch text on one edition, of German another, maybe French, or French captions with the image, and Dutch letterpress. So in this instance, we have a very naturalistic representation. There's not overt allegorical figures. There's not, the types of things we were seeing with the snake or the scale. We have what appears to be a straightforward representation of something that did happen. And that is, these Arminian preachers were told either get in line and start preaching the Calvinist, Gomerist teaching, or leave the Netherlands. And so many of them would not change their religious beliefs, and they leave. They go into exile into Germany and the Southern or Spanish Netherlands. So we even have the wagons numbered, naming these individuals that are leaving. But I want you to pay attention to, too soon, or no, I guess, sorry. So this is very much, we could think of proto-journalism, right? It's an image and text that's telling us about a current event. And certainly scholars have likened these to newspapers, and that's mostly fair. So you have people that want to see and learn about something that's happened. But I would say that we need to be careful in comparing them to newspapers, because newspapers suggest more objectivity than some of these have. Some of these are very, very, very partisan. And so you could think of it as being more like tabloids, right? So yes, you're finding out about things, but it's from a very biased point of view, or sensational. It's about sales. And so it's a spectrum from more objective to more sensational, from more reportage to more yellow journalism. It's a spectrum. Klaus Janssen Visser, who etched and published this, certainly wants you to believe he's being objective. And part of the appeal of his prints is that he's such a remarkably good printmaker. Visser was incredibly important for the development of Dutch landscape prints at that time. Now they're extremely well liked, just as beautiful landscape imagery. And in that case, that boosts the ideological power of the propaganda, because it's an attractive image. It's well composed, it's well made. It sells more readily, and people keep it longer. So it's more effective at propaganda. Aesthetics have an ideological function. But I want to draw your attention to the two guys in the corner, Kees and Joost, who are talking to each other. The one with the sort of pitchfork and the other with his hands sort of gesturing to what's happening. They're having a conversation about what they're seeing. And the letterpress text on this broadside is actually a dialogue between the two of them, talking about not just this event, but this print. They're talking about the print showing the event. You can think about these as basically functioning exactly the same way our news commentators do on partisan news television. So I'm just giving you as examples, that's Fox and Friends at the top and Morning Joe at the bottom. So an example from the left, an example from the right. And I found these two images just by chance putting this talk together, and I won't get into it, but I was very struck by their formal similarities and found that amusing. But I won't make much of that. Again, it was a coincidence. But basically, 400 years ago, the idea of news commentary is still very much a part of how people process recent events. Another thing which we've seen with the snake print is showing people you dislike with your enemies, even if they're dead. So here we have the Armenians. They're on the dung cart, or the cart that carries the night waste, the chamber pot waste out of the city. So already the title is, telling us what they think of these people's religious beliefs. And most of the people in this cart are Armenian preachers, but not all of them, and not all of them were alive when this was made. Two in particular, marked here F and H, were long dead. David Joris, who was executed for heresy and Dirk Volkertsen Krannert, who was an artist and thinker. He was associated also with some more for Calvinist radical religious ideas. So they're basically both just standing in here as people with heretical or questionable religious beliefs. So it's just a way of saying that the Arminians as the whole, on a whole, are heretical, are bad, should leave. And again, political cartoonists now have no problem putting dead people in political cartoons. It's just as a shorthand of saying a person is like a dead or reviled person in the past. It's still, you know, a very effective shortcut. So I want to just show the history of these things quickly. This print by Vischer, you can see mentioned specifically in this image, the circled wagon has a Arminian preacher or remonstrant preacher by the name of Samuel Nuranus, and he's forced to leave, but his son returns to the Netherlands and opens a publishing house. It mostly makes books, but it also, he did make at least some broadsides. And his son, Johannes Nuranus, makes the broadside on the left, and he makes it in the 1660s. So this is 40 years after Oldenbarnevelt is dead, a whole new generation of people who've grown up hearing people argue about whether or not he's a criminal, whether or not he was an innocent. And we see a poem on this saying, Oldenbarnevelt is a martyr for the state. He's not a criminal, he's a martyr. And then immediately you get these rebuttal broadsides, like the one next to it with the smaller portrait, that include the original portrait, but they also include poems that talk about how Oldenbarnevelt is a martyr to his own pride. So he's not a political martyr, he was a person who got what he deserved because he overreached and was proud and vainglorious. So you get these kind of, this sort of pamphlet war. And certainly portraiture remains an extremely important method of reclaiming the lives of people and trying to advocate for justice after someone has been murdered. Again, I won't get into this. You could spend all day talking about the recent artwork with the Black Lives Matter movement. This is all just to say that the methods that we see in 17th century Dutch newsprints, these prints that are 400 years old, whether it's referencing something that's extremely well known, using the likeness of others, including dead people, presenting yourself as news and using commentary to sort of twist and put a perspective, legacy or memorial artwork to reclaim victims and try to craft a legacy of justice in the face of injustice using likeness and remembrance. All of these things are still very much a part of our political communication. Thank you.
And now we will turn things over to Allison Stag. So Maureen, turn off your screen, and Allison, turn yours on and unmute yourself.
I hope this is working. Good evening from Germany. I briefly want to thank the IFPDA for organizing such a full program of online events this month, and of course to Freda and Nadine for inviting me to participate in this session. I'm particularly thrilled to be able to contribute a paper that is based on my forthcoming book on the history of late 18th and early 19th century North American political caricature prints. Today, I will focus on caricature prints. Yeah, here we go. Published between 1789 and 1807 that depict the first three presidents of the United States, George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. While caricatures from this period were not necessarily used in organized election campaigns, they had a wide appeal. They were seen by many and often described in great detail in letters and in diaries. The topic itself on presidential caricature is rather timely, considering we are less than 1 month away from the November 3rd presidential election. And it really seems like every day of this particular election cycle, there has been one sensational event after another, providing enormous amount of content for contemporary cartoonists. To start, I briefly wanted to share some of the more recent election cartoons. And I have to admit, I had a lot of trouble narrowing down the images I wanted to share at the start, because it seems as though each cartoon published is more biting than the last. And I'm sure many of you may have seen these particular cartoons or similar ones online. And we just saw a number of them in Maureen's talk as well. The 3 cartoons you see here were published just in the past 2 days, focusing primarily on Trump and COVID. While contemporary cartoonists use current and sensational news for subject matter, many also turn to historical caricature prints for inspiration. And we only have to look to at least one famous example by the 19th century British artist James Gillray, whose satirical prints have inspired artists during his lifetime well into the present day. And here I show you an 1805 caricature. It's entitled The Plum Pudding in Danger, and a contemporary interpretation from 2016 by the cartoonist Peter Brooks. It's for the British magazine The Spectator. And Brooks replaced the 19th century British politicians with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. While contemporary caricatures are published daily, the same cannot be said for the caricature prints made in the late 1790s and early 1800s United States. These were published infrequently in limited print runs. They were copperplate engravings, separately published and only occasionally colored. Advertisements were placed in newspapers, announcing the sale of a caricature and where it could be purchased. They were sold in print and bookshops, tacked on the walls of barbershops, coffee houses, and taverns. The publication of these prints were rare, and artists were usually inspired to produce a caricature where there had been a particularly newsworthy event. And this is what I'm showing you here. This is a caricature print published anonymously in the summer of 1790 in New York. And it's in reaction to one such newsworthy event that dominated the newspapers in North America at that time. And it's the removal of the capital city from New York to Philadelphia in 1790. In total, 3 separate caricature prints were made, all depicting the Pennsylvania politician Robert Morris as the villain stealing the capital from New York to Philadelphia. And this particular caricature is rather brilliant. It comes from the American Antiquarian Society. It's very rare. It's colored, which is wonderful. And Robert Morris is shown in the middle, and he is actually physically carrying off Federal Hall from New York to Philadelphia. Some of the congressional members are quite excited by this move. They're yelling, "Huzzah for Philadelphia, easy traveling," while others are expressing their dismay. And Robert Morris is not alone in this. He's actually being led by the devil, shown here. This caricature and 2 others made at the time were all published in New York City, and they all were in reaction to the news that the capital would move from New York to Philadelphia. In this period, there was no regularity to the publication of caricature prints. In fact, they were made so infrequently that in some years, no caricature prints were published at all. And this really could be because of the large numbers of imported caricatures from London, which were advertised for sale in North American newspapers and sold by book and print sellers in the major port cities. Such caricatures may have filled a void in the United States for visual satire at that time. At this time, London's caricature market was overpopulated by both artists and working in the medium and by the number of prints published on a daily basis. Caricature prints made in London, such as the example shown here, were made in print runs well into the hundreds. Here, the caricature market was much more advanced than that in the United States. For example, there was an established network that involved artists, printers, publishers, colorists, and apprentices all working together, which did not yet exist in the United States. The most successful artists of the genre in London received patronage from politicians, wealthy citizens, and even the royal family. Because of this, young artists from all over England and Europe went to London to try their luck in this lucrative market. Caricatures could be seen all over London and were sold in print shops, where they featured prominently in shop windows. And you can see in this early 1800s caricature, this can be found at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a crowd of various individuals all peering into this print shop window. You have women, men, young, old, children, all looking at the prints on display shown in this print shop window. Outside of London, despite the majority of caricature prints having subject matter that was relatively topical, they had a wide circulation. Prints were imported to European cities and across the Atlantic Ocean, where they found wide appeal in North American cities. Even during the American Revolution of the 1770s and the 1780s, Interest in North America for British caricature did not decrease, and this was largely because caricaturists in London often sided with the American cause. During this period, it would not have been uncommon in New York City to enter a tavern, a coffee house, or a barbershop, and to see a British caricature nailed to a wall or being passed amongst friends. With the end of the American Revolution in the 1780s, caricatures were still imported from London. There was also a real growing interest to look inwards, and North American newspapers shifted to publishing local news stories that described events taking place within the newly United States. And because of this, especially interesting or noteworthy news stories were caricatured, but only occasionally. The caricature prints from this period were published primarily in New York City and in Philadelphia. This is not surprising because this is where Congress met and this is where some of the new policies were being made. These caricature prints were relatively small in size and were easily transportable. They could be folded several times and enclosed in letters. And I wanted to return briefly to the 1790s caricature that I showed earlier, because we can actually see evidence on some of the caricatures of them being folded. We see creases. Many caricatures have notations on them as well. And I'm not sure if you can see this, but there's a crease here. And it goes all the way to the top, and there's another crease here as well. So this caricature was indeed folded, and it was likely sent in a letter to a friend or a family member. Other caricatures, and this one doesn't have it, but occasionally you can find caricature prints that have little holes on the corners, and this is where they would have been tacked onto a wall or posted somewhere on a fence. The fact that these objects could be easily transported is one reason why, despite so few prints being made at this time, and the impressions being limited in number, caricature prints were comparatively prevalent in early North American culture. Surviving archival documents from politicians to friends and families in other cities not only mention the publication of the prints and the letters, but they actually provide reference to the caricatures within the letters. So a politician or an individual might write a letter and note within the letter that they were also enclosing the caricature. So we know physically that these caricatures move from city to city. The first political caricature on record to have been made in the United States coincided with the very beginning of American democracy, the inauguration of George Washington as the first president of the United States in New York in April 1789. Unfortunately, impressions of this caricature print have not survived, at least not that I know of. So on the slide before you, I'm sharing an 1840s lithograph by Nathaniel Currier, and it depicts Washington being celebrated and feted as he arrived for his inauguration. Descriptions of the caricature print were published in various newspapers and also written about in letters by politicians. And here I also show an excerpt from a letter written by Henry Knox, who acknowledged the caricature of Washington in several letters to other politicians and friends. Other sources, such as newspapers, also mention the circulation of this particular caricature. During Washington's 2 terms in office between 1789 and 1796, very few caricature prints were made in the United States, and Washington was the main subject of nearly 2, neither of which have survived. The physical longevity of caricature prints was not assured. These were topical visual satires, and for the most part, not treated as works of art. Many of the caricature prints that have survived today do so because they were saved alongside primary documents and letters of important politicians. Others were kept as curiosities, and eventually were deposited in public libraries and collections. However, one particular caricature print, published after Washington won re-election at the height of the French Revolution in 1793, was not just simply discarded. Rather, impressions of it were destroyed by party members loyal to Washington. Newspaper reports detailed the efforts of Washington's supporters to suppress the circulation of this particular caricature by setting them on fire. Before they were destroyed, however, they were of course seen. Displayed in prominent locations throughout Philadelphia, which was at that time the capital of the United States, impressions were seen by many. This visibility ensured that while the physical print may not survive, written documents in the form of letters, diary entries, and newspapers provide vivid descriptions of it. According to all known accounts, the caricature depicted Washington and a Supreme Court judge, who was Washington's own appointee by the name of James Wilson. The 2 men, Washington and Wilson, were depicted standing at the guillotine, their heads at the chopping block, a coffin at the ready to take their decapitated bodies, while a straw basket was placed to catch the founding father's head. All around the two men, a crowd gathered to watch the fall of President Washington. The caricature was evidently titled The Funeral of George Washington and James Wilson, King and Judge. Now, because no impression has survived, I have to show you again another British caricature. This was published in 1792 during the French Revolution, 1 year before the Washington caricature was published. The scene is rather similar to what has been described in newspapers and in letters. And also because we know that there were large numbers of imported caricatures coming over from London, it is entirely possible that the caricature and others like it were sent to cities in North America and could have served as inspiration for the unknown artist of the Washington caricature. We also know that Washington was not oblivious to the caricature of him. In fact, he was presented very publicly with an impression of it during a session in Congress, and Thomas Jefferson took note of Washington's reaction. Now, this is according to Jefferson. According to Jefferson, Washington, quote, flew into a rage, end quote, and he listed the reasons for his anger. They were, he was upset that the caricature had been made at all, that the title of the print referred to him as, quote, a king, and not as an elected official, and that so many copies were in circulation. Washington was positively astonished by the disparaging print, and he questioned those around him in the cabinet meetings, how the very people that had voted him into office could so easily turn against him, punishing him with a cruel death. Now, other politicians were more accepting of the caricature prints in circulation, and a number of letters have survived from politicians confiding primarily to their wives about the caricature prints on offer. And this is especially true for politicians that found themselves included in satirical imagery. Many of them actually found it to be an honor to be included in these political caricature prints. One politician included an impression of the caricature to his wife, and he boasted first of being included, and then he lamented on how his profile had been portrayed. He felt that his nose had been portrayed improperly and not correctly. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had both spent considerable time in Europe, and these men actively purchased caricature prints in London, Paris, and later in the United States. And they also encouraged the women in their lives to look at these prints. So Jefferson in particular sent impressions to his young daughters in Virginia, and he explicitly told his daughters to share the caricature prints with friends and neighbors. John Adams' wife Abigail wrote to both her husband and to her female friends about the fashionable caricature market in London, and she too purchased prints and sent these as gifts in letters to family and close friends. Later in his life, John Adams and his daughter-in-law Louisa would correspond about caricatures on offer. John Adams might have been a bit more accepting of such satirical imagery because the only known caricature to depict him was actually favorable to his political policies. And I show you here a very rare impression. The only known impression is known at the New York Historical Society. It was published in July of 1798, and it represents John Adams in the chariot. He's here, right here, and he's leading his newly formed army and horses over, I'm not sure if you can see this, but this is a newspaper editor by the name of Benjamin Franklin Baugh. He opposed John Adams' policies, and he was very influential in writing newspaper articles against John Adams. You can see Baugh here. He reaches out towards his newspaper, and here's a dog peeing on the newspaper as well. You have other politicians trying to rein back John Adams, more of the army behind him, and then also these, underneath it says the cannibals are arriving, and these are meant to be foreigners from France arriving on American soil. The title is above. It reads, "The Times, a Political Portrait," and underneath the phrase, "Triumph government, perish all its enemies, traitors be warned, justice, though slow, is sure." The print refers to the Alien and the Sedition Acts. This was Adams' recent policy to silence those that spoke out against him and members of his party, and to question those coming from other countries, particularly France. Although the artist for this print is unknown, it was advertised for sale in newspapers, sympathetic to Adams. Account books for one publisher reveal that 99 impressions of this caricature were sold in the summer of 1790, and this is when it was published. So it was relatively popular, at least in Philadelphia and with Adams supporters. For me, I have to say it's incredibly surprising that no caricatures of Adams representing him in a negative light have been found. Adams was so often criticized in newspapers abroad, newspapers in the United States. He was mocked for everything, from how he looked to the fact that he was balding, the fact that he was a bit rotund. And it's really surprising to me that I've searched high and low trying to find a caricature that's negative to Adams, and I've yet to find one, but I'm still looking. Instead, it was Jefferson that became the subject of most caricaturist visual attacks. And here you can see a number of the prints that were published during Jefferson's presidency in the first decade of the 1800s. And all the caricatures here were made in North America. They were either published in Philadelphia, New York, or Newburyport, Massachusetts, with the exception of this one right here, the one on the bottom. This was published in London by George Cruikshank. To end my paper today, I want to focus on one of the caricatures from this group. It's entitled "Look on This Picture and on This." This was published in New York City in 1807. This caricature marks a bit of a shift in tone and also in subject matter to the caricatures that had been made previously. Instead of visually mocking Jefferson, the anonymous artist focused on pitting Jefferson against this legendary figure of George Washington, who had been dead for about 8-9 years at this point. But it also showcases an evident knowledge of recent portrait engravings after paintings. Jefferson is given by this anonymous artist attributes that link him to France and to rumors of disloyalty to the American people. Above his portrait, there's a candle which has been extinguished, and dark smoke billows out, marking his time as being up, whereas Washington has been provided with everything positive, everything patriotic. For example, you have a laurel wreath and rays of light emanating from it. And under this portrait of George Washington, there are books that read out order, law, and religion. There's also a verse from Hamlet, which is under both Jefferson and Washington. Under Washington, the verse reads, it might be too small for all of you to see, so I'll read it. See what a grace was seated on his brow, an eye like Mars to threaten and command, a combination and a form indeed, where every god did seem to set his seal to give the world assurance of man. And then underneath Jefferson, you can see there's not much written, but what is written reads, like a mildewed ear blasting his brother. So it was a rather negative interpretation of Jefferson's presidency and who he was as a person. What Jefferson thought of this caricature, of this particular caricature, is unclear. There are no references to it in his letters to any of the prints that attacked him during his presidency. Although we do know he purchased caricatures. So in his account books, these reveal that he purchased caricatures in New York and Philadelphia during this time. So it's likely he perhaps purchased this and then kept it concealed. Between 1789 and the late 1820s, caricature prints were made from engraved copper plates. This printing technique changed in the 1830s for lithography, a cheaper and more efficient means to publish large numbers of caricatures. After this period, caricatures were made a lot more frequently and in higher print runs. They attacked every 19th century president after. My paper today has highlighted a period of printing activity for caricature that is not commonly known. These prints may have been made infrequently and rarely, but they were an important feature in the lives of North Americans. And equally to the cartoons we see today, they provided entertainment and levity during a great period of political uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison. And now we're going to pass on to Carmen Ramos. So Carmen, put on your video and unmute yourself.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Freda, and the other organizers of this event for inviting us to present on an aspect of our upcoming exhibition, Printing the Revolution, the Rise and Impact of Chicano Graphics, 1965 to Now, which is drawn entirely from the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and which opens on November 20th of this year. I'm excited to present as part of today's program because I imagine that many people may be less familiar with the subject of this exhibition, which considers the explosion of Chicano graphic arts among Chicano artists, starting during the Civil Rights era in cities and fields across California, Texas, and other parts of the United States. The Civil Rights era was a particularly transformational, or as we argue, revolutionary time for Mexican Americans, who in adopting the moniker Chicano, reconceived their place on the national stage. To call yourself Chicano, a formerly derogatory term for Mexican Americans, became a cultural and political badge of honor that rejected the goal of melting pot assimilation and questioned the entrenched racist underpinnings of US society. Malaquias Montoya's print, seen here, conveys this ethos. His declarative print announces "I am Chicano" in Spanish, which itself signals his target audience and portrays two brown men donning or holding broken shackles, suggesting a break with the past. That his image was used to promote a documentary of the same name reveals how artists were deeply invested in reaching a public, to the extent that many works have a practical use value. During this period, many artists turned to printmaking to promote an agenda of defiant cultural affirmation and political change, working independently and with labor unions, community and student groups, and in collectives and institutions they founded themselves. Chicano artists created visually arresting works that initially catalyzed the Chicano public coming into awareness of itself. While our exhibition tells a multifaceted story of this graphic movement and its ongoing legacy, today we'll focus on a central characteristic that has remained an undercurrent from the start. We've titled our talk Urgent Images to suggest the ways in which Chicanx artists and their cross-cultural collaborators privileged community engagement around immediate pressing concerns. We argue that much of their work is a form of social practice art, which Susan Lacey has succinctly defined as artistic practice that, quote, resembles political and social activity, but is distinguished by its aesthetic sensibility, end quote. We will offer two snapshots of Chicanx graphics, the early period of the 1960s and the 1970s, when artists used silkscreen and offset lithography as their primary mediums, and the digital turn that began to take root in the 1990s, when artists embraced digital platforms as a basis for their work and its distribution. Some of the earliest work in Sam's collection and in our exhibition reveal the important role of the United Farm Workers Union, founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, as a catalyst for artistic activism. Chavez is a critical figure in the history of Chicano art, as patron, instigator, supporter, and inspiration, who was aware of the central place of symbols and art in social movements. He believed that art could activate reluctant farm workers and garner wide public support. Labor unions have long used graphic media to advance their cause. Chavez undoubtedly learned from this history and his knowledge of Mexican revolutionary art, and inspired by this past, incorporated interdisciplinary artists into the union's activities from the very beginning. He encouraged Luis Valdez to found Teatro Campesino, the innovative theater group incubated within the UFW itself, that staged performances on truck beds, dirt roads, and picket lines, and which were themselves captured in this print. The UFW established their own print shop, El Taller Gráfico, which created and sold calendars, posters, Christmas cards, t-shirts, and bumper stickers to promote the union's message and earn income. While these forms of visual culture were seen as effective organizing tools in boycott cities, they also helped circulate imagery that visually linked the Chicano experience to the history and spirit of Mexican reform movements, which historically had strong links to radical contemporary artists. El Taller Gráfico appropriated and recontextualized prints by the Taller de Gráfica Popular, or TGP artists from Mexico, like Arturo Garcia Bustos and Leopoldo Mendez, and nurtured the talents of Andrews and Miño, whose iconic poster Huelga, or strike, imbibed the satirical style associated with the TGP. Zenmeño's political cartoons regularly appeared in El Marqueado, the UFW's mouthpiece, and true to the newspaper's moniker that can suggest the antics of an outspoken child, they critiqued the hierarchical dynamic between growers and farm workers. Artists not directly affiliated with the UFW also created work in support of its goals. Javier Viramontes created his iconic boycott grapes in 1973, the year Chavez initiated a new boycott in response to the Teamsters' intervention in disputes between the UFW and California growers. Viramontes was aware of the Teamsters' violent tactics, which likely informed his imagery of an Aztec warrior squeezing grapes that spew blood instead of juice. Viramontes himself suggested that the union sell his print to support their cause. While the union believed the print's blood symbolism might be off-putting, they agreed to the artist's term and sold the print via mail order. This example demonstrates how Chicanx graphics imagery, its affiliation networks, and distribution all register a sense of political agency. Another characteristic is the materiality of the prints themselves. This work by an unidentified artist, which promotes a pro-labor boycott Gallo wines message, was printed on recycled computer tractor paper, likely obtained by the artists from their college campus, an acknowledged practice at the University of California at Berkeley, starting in the late 1960s. And here you see the front and back of the print. It's important to highlight a crucial point, that Chicanx graphics rose during the global social movements of the 1960s that so often critically deployed prints and other forms of visual culture. Rupert Garcia's early career demonstrates these global connections. As a student at San Francisco State during the strike of 1968, Garcia recalled what led him and his fellow activists to turn to silkscreen posters. In an interview, he stated, quote, "The impetus was Alf Young from England, the instructor who was teaching part-time at San Francisco State. He talked about his experiences in Paris in 1968 and what the students were doing there in terms of the rebellion and how they were using silkscreen posters as a way to articulate visually their points of view. So when we heard that, we thought seemingly in unison, that's what we need to do," end quote. Garcia became a key figure in the Third World Liberation Front, a coalition of Chicano, African-American, Asian-American, and Native students who demanded ethnic studies programs at the university. Garcia created this poster during that protest. To capture the solidarity among students, he combined the likeness of Che Guevara, a Cuban revolution icon who became a global symbol of political resistance, with the popular Black Power slogan, "Right On." Here, Garcia marshals language and symbolic sign systems to attack white supremacy. Garcia sold his prints, including his iconic "No More This Shit," which retools pop strategies to launch a biting critique of racism, to raise funds for the Student Bail Fund, as seen in this ad from the journal Leviathan. Chicano artists responded immediately to unfolding history, and their prints register galvanizing events and public responses. As a young artist, Yolanda Lopez allied herself with Free the People 7, a campaign calling for the release of a group of young Latino men arrested for allegedly killing a police officer in San Francisco. Adding to a long list of artworks from this period by artists like David Hammond and Faith Ringgold that manipulated the American flag in order to highlight the cleavage between the proclaimed and lived values of the United States. Lopez turns the stars and stripes of the flag into padlocked prison bars that partially obscure the faces of 6 men. She surrounds the central image with an adapted quote of the Pledge of Allegiance, which ironically ends with the word "free." The print was paraded at rallies and reproduced in the pages of Basta Ya, or Enough, the campaign's newspaper published in collaboration with the Black Panthers. As I turn the screen to Claudia Zapata, who will consider the digital turn in Chicanx graphics, I want to underscore that paper-based graphic arts remain a viable mode of artistic production. Important artists like Esther Hernandez, who created the iconic print Sunman in 1982, which critiques the harmful impact of pesticides on farm workers and is relevant again today in light of the impact of COVID on essential workers, actively produces screen prints about the present. In 2006, she reimagined her print to condemn workplace raids of the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement. In addition to changing the title to Sunraid, she outfits her skeletal figure with an iced wrist monitor and a huipil, a traditional indigenous garment to suggest how Native people from the Americas represent a sizable segment of the undocumented. I now leave you with Claudia Zapata.
Great, thank you. The emergence of Web 2.0, or the interactive web-based experience, has fundamentally changed the web user's landscape and is a significant part of Chicanx graphics. This iteration of the web is defined by a founding principle of an architecture of participation. Interactivity among users defines the social network boom in the aughts with the emergence of Facebook in 2004, Twitter in 2006, and Tumblr in 2007, amongst many others. These new channels, along with the artist's quotidian use of image editing software such as Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator, result in unique generational modalities of digital artistic production. Artists are now able to create born digital graphics, or images that are electronically developed and distributed. These digital creations may never exist in the paper form. Rather, the artists offer their artworks for their online followers to either print and distribute or repost and promote. Digital's unfettered portability translates to endless shareability through the internet and its communal platforms. And for Chicanx artists, this digital pipeline allows them to promote socially conscious graphics that interpret the political zeitgeist and act as a form of advocacy and pedagogy for both online and offline communities. Bay Area artist Fabiano Rodriguez uses her online channels as a mouthpiece for her activism. Rodriguez self-identifies as an artivist, a portmanteau of artist and activist, recalling the early Chicano art movement's practice of interpreting one's own artwork as a vehicle for social change. Today, with so many more channels available for her advocacy, Rodriguez's transmedia pervasiveness proffers her users a foundational image gallery for them to create what Rodriguez cites as, quote, their own movement media, end quote. Her works, such as Migration is Beautiful, have become iconic images around contemporary immigration advocacy. Shared across several platforms, Rodriguez invites users to take her images and disperse them across social networks. She is most well known for her use of the monarch butterfly, an image meant to recall the fluid migratory patterns across the Americas and signify what she defined as, quote, a symbol of fluid and peaceful migration, end quote. Migration is Beautiful's design also makes a nod to the sunray patterns prominent in the work of Emory Douglas, a graphic artist for the Black Panther Party, and the thick strokes that characterize the Xerox art of activist artist Renee Templeton. Rodriguez's accompanying phrase, migration is beautiful, is part of what journalist Christina Constantini refers to as, quote, a hopeful rebranding of the immigration movement, end quote. The message is positive, but most importantly, it is, as Rodriguez states, demanding and declarative. This approach to social justice iconography is just as impactful as images that incite action and revolution because it humanizes the marginalized without a need to see them suffer. Fellow artivist Julio Salgado uses blogs to highlight queer immigrants. As a mentee of Fabiano Rodriguez and a queer undocumented artist, Salgado is part of an artivist community that aims to rethink immigrant movement branding by redefining the intersectional communities that fundamentally comprise it. Salgado's artistic efforts focus on the experience of the undocuqueer, or immigrants that are both undocumented and queer. In a post on his Tumblr site in 2012, Salgado sought out other undocuqueers asking for a photo of themselves and a personal reflection on their intersectional identities as an undocumented queer person. Salgado then created brightly colored digital portraits with hand-drawn text responses to share across social media platforms. Emphatic responses reflected the relief of exposure, as in the caption for I am undocuqueer Reina W. Coming out of the shadowy closet, undocumented and queer, join me. Coming out of the closet is a recurring metaphor that the LGBTQ plus community closely aligns with the personal process of coming to terms with and sharing of one's own sexual identity. In this context, the metaphor suggests the additional variable of repressive existence for the undocuqueer. As an undocumented artist, Salgado initially feared that engaging with street art might mean incarceration and deportation, so he sought social media as an alternative gallery space. These digital platforms provide undocuqueer online users with increased mobility, intimacy, and often anonymity, together with a community and a sense of empowerment to move their declarations offline if they so choose. The organization of social movements and their interplay between online and offline activism is part of liberation movements such as Black Lives Matter. In 2013, a Florida jury acquitted George Zimmerman of murder after the fatal shooting of Trayvon Martin. The verdict sparked intense social media discussion, prompting Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi to create hashtag Black Lives Matter. This online community coalesced into a decentralized global network aimed at mobilizing efforts to, quote, end state-sanctioned violence against Black people, unquote. Artists such as Ori Original created works in solidarity with these efforts, focusing on singular portraits of individuals killed by law enforcement in his ongoing series, Justice for Our Lives. The project consists of a series of black and white digital portraits with each victim's likeness and name available for download on Original's website. The black and white austerity makes the images affordable for users to print out and disseminate in their communities. Original's vectored illustration, often based on family photographs, highlight the positive memories that remain with relatives and capture the youth of many of the deceased, such as Justice for Aiyana Jones. In 2010, 7-year-old Aiyana Jones died after a SWAT team member shot her in the head during a raid of the family's Detroit home. These portraits act as a pedagogical resource centered on a critical conversation around race, systemic oppression, and state-sanctioned violence. Original also wheat pastes his portrait throughout San Francisco's Mission District, creating a gridded wall of loss monumentalizing the dead. Original's digital artistic practice is part of a meditative process of honoring the deceased while making resources available for communities calling out the injustice of their death. Artists like Lalo Alcaraz and his dedicatory image of gun control activist Emma Gonzalez occupy the same urgency. In 2018, Emma Gonzalez survived the shooting at Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Several days later, she gave an impassioned speech on live television advocating for stronger gun control. Alcaraz digitally illustrated her portrait after watching her televised delivery. He then posted it on his social media channels, asking people to distribute the image across social media platforms or download a high-resolution file from his website for personal printing. The image features a portrait of Gonzalez along with "We Call BS," a reference to her speech in which she called out government officials for the lack of gun reform. In the lower register, the hashtags Gun Control Now and Stand With the Kids add to the social media centered trending tags like hashtag Never Again, used by Parkland survivors to lobby for solidarity and gun reform. Alcaraz's transmedial image sharing across multiple platforms is common practice among Web 2.0 artists, where the image exists in artist websites, blogs, social media channels, and often in print form. The artist's social media post space is a critical intersection for direct engagement with social media followers, with the allotted caption space acting as a direct conversation with the audience. Digital scholar Angelica Becerra argues that this digital caption space acts as an artist statement, wherein the artist provides commentary regarding the image's objective. In this case, Alcaraz urges users to print his image for social protest or share the image in solidarity with Emma Gonzalez. This transmedial distribution and subsequent recreation of the artwork by the user defines the portrait of Gonzalez as an open source artwork. Open source is primarily associated with software sources that owners make freely accessible to the general public for redistribution and modification at no cost. Artists are echoing the software's iterative capabilities by allowing their images to be redistributed and altered. The user's shareable image may vary in size, context, and caption. The new personal caption attached to a shareable image then becomes a reconfiguration of the artwork itself, a folksonomic effort at attaching metadata of the user's choosing for organizing and connecting. These digital images recall early Chicano graphic artists and their characteristics of sharing one image at little to no cost in order to support the urgency of a cause. Unfortunately, several causes that artists are still advocating for are just as relevant from the 1960s as they are today. And this is the key to understanding Chicanx graphics. This narrative of resistance is the through line that remains intact, this political consciousness that will not be quelled. Chicanx artists will continue to employ their graphic work as a means of radical change and deserve both a political and art historical recognition for their significant contributions to graphics history. These works often act as the historical record for communities that are elided from US memory and continue to serve as their representative. Chicanx graphics is the harbinger for the change soon to come. Thank you.
Thank you. This was really, really interesting, and the whole event was very interesting. All the talks were fascinating. I hope you noticed that I put up my own political print that I had behind me, which is a German copy of a Dutch 17th century comment on the Armenians. So just in honor of this event. One of the questions that was asked, and I was asking myself the same question, was for Carmen and Claudia. First, it's about what is your approach more generally to collecting this material? Are you thinking of it as art? I mean, how do you decide what to collect? And then the other question, which I think a lot of museums are dealing with right now, has to do with these prints that are available online, and how do you approach collecting artwork that's available to download for free, both ethically and practically? The person who wrote in the question, I've noticed that many of the credit lines specify that they are purchases. So can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Well, at the beginnings of our collection really was a gift from Tomás Rivera Fausto, who's a foundational scholar of Chicano art and culture, and collected this work throughout the course of his activism, his academic activism. And I think his collection really established the foundation of our holdings. And when we started organizing the exhibition, we wanted to really bring the collection up to date, because what we had was somewhat of a time capsule, sort of a 1960s time capsule. And we were really interested in thinking about what has happened to Chicano graphics, now Chicanx graphics, since the 1960s, and I think that we, really were, very open to, as was Tomás when he started his collection, into what we define as Chicanx graphics. Many of these artists went to art school, right? While I think the history of Chicanx graphics has sort of existed outside of the history of American print culture and fine art print culture, right? You can sort of find more discussions of Chicanx graphics in sort of this field of, general political graphics that sort of takes place more outside of the museum context. But many of these artists, most of these artists were art school trained. Yolanda Lopez, was the student of Martha Rosler, right? So they very much belong in a sort of, art world museum context. So we were very much, thinking about that and about really helping shift the sort of ways in which the history of American printmaking has really excluded these artists, from that history and from that trajectory. And I think it is we have at the museum, obviously, a program of time-based media art. So we have been thinking already a lot within the context of that program in terms of works that exist in digital-born works in many ways. So this was somewhat of a, of an extension of that. I think what's different in the context of our exhibition is that we're going to be presenting works on screens in the show. That's going to be part of, what we're doing. We're not printing a work that was created digitally, unless the artist did it. But if the work was circulating only in digital space, that's the way that we're presenting it in the context of the museum. I don't know, Claudia, if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think the digital aspect of the graphics interpretation offers a whole set of possibilities in terms of just arts administration. There were so many like, how do we deal with that? And I think that poses a good protocol for future learning and just recognizing what's been going on in terms of artistic production, because the same parameters that you may use to acquire digital works are completely different. Because, for example, if an artist primarily shared an image to be circulated and it was a JPEG, but someone's asking for the highest resolution, then you're not technically getting the context of that artwork in terms of how it was organized by the artist. So one is this artistic situation and the other is the context of preservation. And sometimes they're at odds with each other. So this kind of questionable, what's the next step? And then if some artists, for example, they shared a PDF and they wanted it to be printed, and then they take photos of people using the printed digital image and then share that online, it becomes this kind of ongoing networked experience that you really need to contextualize in either the labels or catalog or something like that, and thinking of it as like a sculpture in terms of this context in which it exists, the interface, this frame that most users would consume the image. So you really need to articulate, and that's why I brought up these captions and other things in regards to networks, that because there's all these other things attached to how that image existed in the outside world, in this case, outside world being the digital. So it's actually not IRL's in real life, but in the digital world.
Great, thank you. Very interesting. Let me have a question for Allison. I think several people are wondering about sort of the rarity of these works. So one person asked, how were caricatures collected in the US in albums like fine prints? And another person asked, is the rarity of American caricatures about them being more ephemeral objects, or is it about not many being printed?
So to the first question, most of the caricatures were not placed in albums, although there was one album that was found in somebody's attic. This woman was just looking for something else, and down came all these boxes, and in one of the boxes was an album that dates to 1807 of American caricatures and British caricatures that had been put together by a bookseller in New Hampshire. And that bookseller advertised that you could come to his bookshop, you could rent them by the day, by the week, by the month, and it was for entertainment, for tea parties, and for political meetings. But that's the only reference I've found to American caricatures being put into albums in the period. Most of the caricatures were, they were saved because they were of interest, because they represented important politicians, important people of the day. The majority were discarded at some point just because they were ephemeral. They weren't meant to be kept. So the ones we have, it's really fortunate that they were saved, and they were saved primarily because of who they represented, or who was represented within the caricatures, and the fact that they were saved with these important politicians' diaries and letters, etc. So they are incredibly rare. It's been through going into account books and trying to find any traces of caricatures being sold. That's when we get an idea of the print runs and how many prints were actually published of the caricature itself. But they are rare. Most of the caricatures I showed you, they're the only known impressions. I always hope that more will be found. You never know what's lurking in somebody's attic or closet. So it's my hope, especially with my book being published, I'll have a catalog with the book. And that will include every reference to a caricature in newspaper, in letters that are not known today in any collection. And it's my hope that when this is published, more people will come forward and say, no, we have this, or no, it's in this collection and it just hasn't been digitized. So you never know what might happen in the next few years.
Well, that will be exciting. Okay, I have a question for Maureen from Larry Silver. Most of the satires that you showed were from the dominant power side, the Moritz Gomarist faction. Is that impression fair? And there are also prints of resistance from the Oldenbarnevelt Armenian losing faction, albeit perhaps in smaller numbers? Or was this kind of imagery not used as a weapon by their more liberal and educated party?
That's a great question. So for the most part, the dominant side, the winning side, makes way more imagery, and that's for two reasons. Early on, the kind of, he's right, more educated, more moneyed side kind of sees it beneath them to use this medium. And even the Gomerists, the religious half, tend to favor really long theological arguments, like thick textual, no images at all, books to make their case rather than images. And then after they've lost, there's one print, I think from Antwerp, that shows the Gomerists, the winning side, as devils. But yeah, for the most part, they don't really go to imagery until much later to make their point. And when they do make any attempt at all, there's a portrait of one of Oldenbarnevelt's allies, Rambert Hoherbeets, and it's published when he's in prison, and it's merely factual information, his name, that he's a diplomat, that he's served these political offices, and it's censored by the government, and the printmaker and publisher are fined 100 guilders, which is a sizable amount, and the plate and impressions are seized. And that's not a polemical image, it's just a portrait with factual information. So the Dutch government made it quite clear they would not tolerate even implied criticism. So there was self-censorship with the artists.
I thought Klaas-Jan Visser, isn't he on the side of is it the contra-remonstrance or the remonstrance? And I know Hundius was a remonstrant, so they were on different sides, but it seems to me what you said about the printmakers, a lot of the Gomarists, a lot of them coming from the southern Netherlands, you get a lot of printmakers on that side of the argument.
You do. It's just a much bigger group. It's, a really disproportionately large side. So these printmakers, many of them did have sympathies for that group or were members of that group. But even if you weren't and you wanted to sell more copies, making copies for the much, much, much bigger group would make fiscal sense.
Okay, I have one last question for Carmen and Claudia. A lot of questions are coming in about the choice of silkscreen as the medium of urgent images. So can you talk a bit about that? Obviously before digital came about.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. One of the first print that I showed, which is Yo Soy Chicano by Malaquías Montoya, he, like Rupert Garcia, were very critical figures in the Bay Area. And he got his sort of silkscreen training in a commercial context. So there's this sort of real connection. That's how it sort of initially, came in, is through really working in a commercial way, and really in this very practical way that Rupert Garcia learned his trade, which is he went to school to become a painter, and then the strike happened and he became a silkscreen artist, right? So they, many of these artists had these kind of transformations, in their own lives during the 60s. And then, of course, starting in, the late 1960s and through the 70s, many Chicano artists started their own, collectives, their own organizations, print shops, that really, where silkscreen was the primary mode of artistic production. Places like Self-Help Graphics, collectives like the Royal Chicano Air Force. Silkscreen really became used because of its affordability, because of its adaptability, because of its ability to create posters that drew the attention of people. And as I mentioned, so much weight was given to public engagement, to community engagement. It's a medium that really is very useful and is very adaptable to situations.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you so much to everyone. Maureen Warren, Allison Stag, Carmen Ramos, and Claudia Zapata. Thank you very much. It's been really a fascinating discussion today. And I believe that these talks will be posted online eventually. So if you want to hear them again, if you know friends who missed today's session, please let them know. And I believe it'll be, IFPDA will send out a notice about that. Thank you very much. Hopefully next year we will be back at the Met, but maybe with a online component so we can get another 250 people listening to these wonderful talks next year. So thank you very much, and stay tuned for many more events coming up in the coming month from the IFPDA Print Month.